It's supposedly the most wonderful time of the year, and for those of us in Christian-based cultures, that means one thing: presents. Or Jesus Christ, even. Yes, that's it, Jesus Christ. The presents are a symbol of the gifts given by the three wise men, or the Magi, as you prefer, to Jesus, and that's why we do it. It's not about the presents. Okay, got that out of the way. But because I go out on Fridays and Christmas Day is on a Tuesday, I didn't know what to do. I was like, do I do one or do a sandwich? And I've gone for sandwiching the day. Why not? And I was looking into things I could do, and I remembered the idea that Robocop is the Jesus story. Some of you out there might say, but it's more of an Easter story because it's the whole dying resurrection thing. And to you I say, shut up, I'm doing it. But if you're not familiar with the theory, it is the fact that Alex Murphy dies, is resurrected, and does some kind of miraculous things after his resurrection. Although Jesus did miraculous things before, it's kind of an out of order, perhaps, Jesus narrative, you might say, in certain aspects. But it intrigued me. And it was enough of a reason for me to go, yes, I'll have a look at it. Now, of course, when I say Robocop, I'm talking 1987 original, directed by Paul Verhoeven. I'm not talking the 2014 reboot. That's its own thing. There are people who love it, there are people who hate it, and there are people in between. This isn't to slate that film, but I will quickly say, it's its own thing. Some of it doesn't work even taken on its own merits, but it's its own thing. I don't consider it a Robocop film in the same way. I'm obviously also not talking about the sequels because diminishing returns, shall we say, over time, and they obviously don't talk about the Jesus analogy at all. So we're strictly talking about the OG 1987. And yes, this is a great film, before I go into all that, on its own merits. It's a classic for a reason. It's still beloved to today and onwards, I'm sure, because of the messages in it, because of how it tells a story, because of how cynical and hopeful it can be, which is a bit of a staple of Paul Verhoeven's work. But it wouldn't have been great without, obviously, the work of Mr. Verhoeven, but also his cast. And that comes from the top down. Not only did Peter Weller do a great job both in and out of the suit, but Nancy Allen did great. Ray Wise is in this, Dan O'Herlihy, Ronnie Cox, Miguel Ferrer, some of which you may recognise also from Twin Peaks. This was a cast of great people, and even the bit parts did really well. Mr. Kinney's death, one of the greatest moments, sold well by a guy just flailing miserably while squibs were going off. Apparently more squibs than he was expecting, but it's Verhoeven. This is what he does, over the top stuff. Everyone really did a great job in this, and it was thoroughly enjoyable because of those performances. Some of them may have seemed slightly over the top, but I think that is what made it work. But the film itself, like I said before, it's Alex Murphy, new cop transferred in, dies on the job. His remains are used for this Robocop procedure, but enough of him's still there that he starts to remember who he was, who killed him, uncovers this massive tale of corruption and capitalist greed, and takes his revenge. And, it's such an uplifting tale in some ways, because it's just a guy who was doing the right thing. He was killed in the line of duty. He was a force for good, and he was killed by those who didn't really recognise and respect his authority. And that does parallel with Jesus. I mean, the first shot he receives after being put to his knees is in a hand, which is very similar to a crucifixion nail. I think historians have said if it was true, it was more like in the wrist, but because we think of it with the hand, it was perfect. That shot to the hand was a perfect shorthand way, if you'll excuse the weird inherent pun there, of saying what that scene was. That was the crucifixion right there. He was hung out to dry. But one thing actually came to me during the first sort of third of the film, and it's something that Miguel Ferrer says as Bob Morton, that they've been transferring cops into this precinct, knowing that this area is rife with crime, knowing that he wanted to do the Robocop program. He was hand-picking candidates from throughout the police force and transferring them to this hellish area of old Detroit. That's really, if everyone thinks like Bob Morton kind of gets a bit of a, a bad rap here, and kind of gets, an over the top death, he doesn't deserve it. I think that justifies and shows just actually how awful this guy is. He's moving good cops to get killed by Boddicker and his crew. So there. I hope your sympathy for Morton is somewhat lessened here. But of course, Robo is built, he's manufactured, and he's put out on the streets. But of course, Lois starts to notice. She realises that there's something other here. And I suppose if you wanted to look at the Jesus analogy, you could argue maybe she's a Mary Magdalene stand-in. It does make sense in that context. But she realises who he is because of his twirling gun in the range. And she wants to bring him back. She wants to find out what happened, why he's like this, how is he. Everyone's kind of there going, wow, this new thing. Kind of like Jesus with the miracles. So many people were like, wow, look at what he's doing. But there were groups behind the scenes going, this is wrong, we need to shut this down. And as the film progresses, as Robocop returns more to Murphy, shall we say, we start to see the turn of the tide. We see the people, or particularly OCP and some of the police force, turn to an almost resentment of Robocop. So once again, he's laid low, he's beaten down, and then we get the reveal that, Prime Directive 123 we knew about, 4 was classified, and we learn what it was. It was that he cannot hurt someone in OCP. And whilst this isn't, part of the Jesus analogy, it's a very nice reference to the zeroth law. Now, some of you may be like, zeroth law? What is this? Everyone knows the 3 laws, so I'm not going to reiterate them here. But Asimov did write in the zeroth law to supersede that based on his numbering structure. The lower number was high priority. And the zeroth law is basically no robot can through action or inaction harm humanity as a whole. Which is a great, overriding. If any of those laws would actually end up with harming humanity as a whole, scrap it, it doesn't matter. Wipe that from, your action queue. And in a similar way, Directive 4 supersedes the others because upholding the law would involve taking Dick Jones in. But it overrides it. And obviously, with the zeroth law, it doesn't cause robots to shut down, necessarily. Although I suppose it would, if they have a logic quandary, that they can't resolve. But, this is where the machine and man fight really takes its centre stage, I think, in Robocop. When he's fighting against the 4th directive, and even at the end, when he's more human than he was before. He's come through, destroyed Boddicker's gang, and he still can't supersede it until the old man says, Dick, you're fired, and we get the wonderful super long arm scene, which is great. I love it. But he obviously does so many things, like his wonderful aim and things like that, which could be argued as miracles. The walking on water scene, which is kind of the linchpin for the argument for a lot of people. But now I've watched it in full, and I've looked over it, I don't remember anything about Jesus shooting, muggers and potential rapists in the crotch, for one. Well, I'm sure he could. And, the out of orderness, I think the idea that Robocop is Jesus is stretching it. But I'm glad I rewatched it, because it gave me the love back. It made me watch that awful scene with Paul McCrane, the help me splooshy guy thing. I watched this at far too young an age because I was growing up in the 80s and that's what we did. But that image, that scene of him being hit with a car and the help me and everything like that, all of that part for Paul McCrane has tortured me mentally to this day. And now I've rewatched it, I'm sure for the next couple of weeks I'm still going to be thinking of it. But I did it for you. But Robocop, 1987 original, I loved. It's got the Verhoeven touches of the news feeds and the ads, kind of like what we saw in Starship Troopers. It's got a very light Jesus metaphor that isn't necessarily 100% throughout the story. It's got a great story of a guy trying to regain his humanity and take down capitalist overlords. So, it's maybe not a Christmas film in hindsight, but It was a nice Christmas treat to myself. But I promise next time we'll do something that's definitely more Christmassy. That's a promise. But until then, as always, thanks for watching and take care. Yes, Peter Weller does a great job, and Nancy Lewis does... Nancy Lewis. Nancy Lewis. Well done, Paul. That's a blooper reel one right there, isn't it?